It's our last episode before the election. Today we're talking about how pastors should equip their flock, and then we're actually just going to dive into politics one last time before November 5th. Welcome to the To Be the Church podcast, where we explore what it looks like to truly be the church in today's culture. I'm Tyler, that's Andrew, and it's November.
It is, Ty. Hey, just real quick, at podcast school, they teach us to say something personal at the beginning, right?
You went to podcast school?
Your voice is a little rusty there.
Bro, I woke up Sunday morning and had to go to, I got to go to a church in Hillsboro where our new locally pastor of Heritage Park is being commissioned. So I woke up and I was like, I don't feel great. And then left there, went to a Chiefs bar in Portland to watch the Chiefs game with my dad.
That's your problem.
Went to this dive bar. And I walked in 20 minutes before the game started, and there was just two guys sitting at the bar, and that was the only people in there total. Yeah. And they were both wearing Chiefs hats, and I was like, this is the place where the Chiefs game's going to be on, fully? And he's like, yep, because I had called the night before and whatever. And then over the next 25 minutes, 80 people came in probably. Maybe 50 to 80 people, somewhere in there. But it was so cool. And they weren't just wearing Chiefs gear, they were wearing Kansas City gear. So this lady walked in with a t-shirt, my favorite barbecue place. And it's it was cool. But anyway, went to the Chiefs game, or watched the Chiefs beat the Raiders. Shout out. And then came to member night. And about right when member night was starting, I was like, oh, I think I might be legit getting sick. Yeah. And then I went home and I told Katie the next day is my day off, and I was like, I was in bed 16 hours today. Whoa. So, and then I felt better, and I feel good. I just sound like a radio DJ now.
That's what I'm saying. The voice, I thought maybe you pounded a little whiskeys and cigars before this just to be ready for the to be responsibly.
That's what they taught me at podcast school.
All right, dude. So you were saying I stepped all over the lead-in. Go ahead.
Oh, no, you're good. It's November now. I mean, it'll be November tomorrow.
Yeah.
But it's November when this comes out, which means it's only 5 days until the NFL trade deadline.
Is it on election day? I think it is.
No, the election is on trade deadline day. But in reality, it is. Yes, it is the same day. Yeah. But we're not going to talk about the trade deadline. Last chance before the election to talk politics. We get questions about it all the time.
Comments.
And often when we talk about it, we get responses back that but wait, if you aren't doing this, you're failing everything, and if you all that. And so, one last episode before the election, just to talk about politics, but specifically to try to answer the question, to what level and how much and how should a pastor equip his flock politically? Yeah. So we talked last week or a couple weeks ago about how we try to equip people from the pulpit specifically. And we even mentioned there that there are churches right now that are doing Jesus and Politics sermon series, and there are churches who are doing policy specific articles and hey, here's who I think you should vote for, stuff like that. Sure. But let's talk about that for today. To what level and then how should a pastor equip his flock politically? Yeah,
and that's good. And so I think, and this is even our tagline here, we equip the church to be the church in Northwest Gospel Church. To be the church is the name of this podcast. Our lead-in is what, Tyler? We're here to
explore what it looks like to truly be the church in today's culture.
To truly extra be the church in today's culture. Okay, and that's, I think, the big one that for me, this election cycle has been, at least in the last week or two, been something I've been thinking through, praying through a little bit. Our culture is so political right now, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's a presidential election year. You see this every 4 years, but I think with technology the way it is now, with Twitter, with all these things, this is constantly on people's minds. Now, we had said a couple of weeks ago the reality that for me, this being my fourth presidential election cycle at this local church, it has felt less less of a thing within the church in terms of people talking about it or being stressed about it and those kind of things. I think part of that might just be the exhaustion. I also think part of that is that this is not a super complicated election in the sense of it's the first time in I don't know, 100 years in America, where you have like a former president running for office against kind of a current incumbent vice president. But right. And so, and I'm even trying to think back, I feel like Teddy Roosevelt at one point in the early 20th century ran again, but I don't even know if he was running against an incumbent. So this might be the first time that you have like a former president who was just in office for 4 years and a current regime that's in office right now, a VP running against each other. So it's like a lot of stuff is known here. A lot of stuff is like, so, but all that to say, like, I do feel like to what level, and the question is to what level and how should a pastor equip his flock politically? And I think we need to equip the church to be the church and to confront every area of life with a Christ-centered perspective. And so I do think churches should equip their people politically. The question is how to do that. And like we've said, there are guys preaching through, thematic series on, here's the 4 weeks on Jesus and politics. I don't fault anybody for doing that. Like, we're intentionally going through Colossians. We talked about that on our last podcast a couple of weeks ago. But here's just a few areas that I feel like the how question can be answered. In the pulpit, I think you can equip your people politically in the pulpit when the text dictates. A week ago, we had a text that really hammered on sexual ethics, and I emphasized that. In that discipleship, group life, whatever that looks like, small groups, community groups within your churches, I think those are discussion areas where like we don't regulate what those discussions become. Like we these are sermon-based deals. So when those areas go into politics, like great, like equip the church. Like Ephesians 4, we equip the church to be the church so that the body builds itself up, right? And so we're trying to equip God's people who the Spirit is empowering in order to like think biblically on things. And so that happens constantly within small group, group life, discipleship context. I do think like political issues are good things to discuss in, like NGC University that we have coming up here. Actually the Saturday right after the election, and certain things that have been in the news politically. One of these offerings that I'm pretty pumped about, I'm going to be out that week out of state with my wife for her birthday, but like if I was able to be there, I'd just attend this class to see it. What's it called? Brandon Adams is doing a class on...
Yeah, it's called Will All Israel Be Saved?
Yeah.
A look at Romans 9 through 11
yeah.
with special attention to 11:26 is what it's called.
And so I'm like, and because Israel, and that's been in the news a ton, and politics and these kind of deals, and Brandon is brilliant and a member here, and so he's going to teach on that, which is definitely an issue that like has political undertones to it and those things. But just equipping the church in context like that, and even NGC University is a good example of like, this is not necessarily something that like you have to be a pastor here to teach it. That like we have tons of church members who have certain issues they've studied. And they go, okay, the next NGC University, I'd love to teach on this. And they would obviously dialogue with the pastor on that. And we'd kind of overview what they're going to go through and the content and those kind of things. And then giving people the opportunity to do that. I don't know how many classes we have at NGCU this time, 8 or 9, it feels like.
Yeah, 5 maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but that tends to be something where it's like, that's an open forum where our church equips our church. Leadership training in our hiring processes, with our eldership training, our deacon training, how we handle ourselves politically, even how we handle ourselves online as it relates to political issues is stuff we talk through in all those leadership equipping processes. And so all this to say, there's a ton of how that's going to happen. But again, the key way is we equip the body from leadership so that the body can build itself up in love, right? So the pastor, like, I'm a chief equipper, right? And we are chief equippers as elders and pastors, but like, we're not brand managers, right? We're not public service announcement hosts. And we're not even like the quote unquote spokesman for the church, despite what people may want to, presume on that. Like, the pastor is a chief equipper, is a word preacher, is a leadership developer, and the body needs to, empowered by the Spirit, get equipped and then work to equip others. That's the key, I think, in the area of politics or in any area, right? And so,
okay, so what would you say then if the pastor is not the PSA host specifically, or brand manager, and you're trying, all that? What would you say to the person that is like, I just want my pastor to hand me a voting guide and tell me here are the people to vote for based on what that pastor thinks? What would you say to that person?
I'd say meet with that pastor and have, ask him ask him for his voter guide.
Okay, well, let's,
you know what I'm saying? Or you're saying,
let's flip it. Let's say like somebody says, Andrew, you need to publish who you're voting for so that your church can vote.
Yeah. So I would say, I would like for the person who would say that, and there are those, especially online these days, that are like, here's what the pastor needs to say. Here's what the pastor needs to preach. Here's what the pastor needs to do. And I would say respectfully to those people, like, no, like I'm going to study the word. I'm going to do the job that God's called me to do, which is to equip the body to be the church. Right. And like, I get very irritable personally when there's like these there's these like specific non-biblically bound issues where people go, this is what, like you see this all the time on Twitter. Unless your pastor is saying this regarding this issue, leave that church. And dude, this happens from every end of the aisle, right? In 2020, there were people all the time, unless your pastor is saying this on this racial moment, he's a racist, so you should leave your church. Or unless your pastor is promoting this with the vaccine or handling this in this way.
Does he really love his neighbor?
He doesn't love his neighbor. And so this happens from all sides of the aisles. This happens in every political issue. And I just go this is not...
well, as an example of that happening from the other side, we're not Southern Baptist, but there was something that happened at the Southern Baptist Convention a handful of years ago where like they do all these resolutions as a Southern Baptist, and they do them real quickly and whatever. And there was this one that was anti-abortion, and like on its surface, it was like, great, cool, push it through. But really what it was saying, unless your pastor is saying this specifically about abortion, he's actually pro-choice. And it was
and that's where you're getting to the abolitionist movement versus the incrementalist movement. Right. And so just to speak to that, obviously, like the being pro-life, to use that terminology, speaking about with moral clarity on the issue of abortion is a necessity for biblically sound pastors and churches, undoubtedly, right? And so, but the approach that we take politically to the abortion issue, incrementalism, which is kind of like that,
kind of classic pro-life.
Classic pro-life, and lived in that movement for years, grew up in that movement. My mom was the president of California Right to Life for years, and so like as a young kid, I was like, involved with that stuff on sort of an activist level, and understanding like the incrementalist movement, which is like slowly put in judges, pass laws that restrain this more and more and more and more, while you're reaching the culture and you're building a culture of life, versus the abolitionist movement, which is like effectively you say this needs to be abolished, and here's the way to go about abolishing it. And unless you're going to do that and go for that, let's say like a national abortion ban amendment or whatever, then like you're not sufficiently pro-life. Those are two different like angles of handling that issue, and you can be sufficiently biblically pro-life and understand the pragmatic environment that we're in politically to go like, so wherever your conscience lies on how to go about that, biblically, you must be pro-life. Like you cannot make an excuse for the slaughter of innocent children. And this idea even that I saw this the other day, which is I think a great picture of this, like what the gospel teaches us and what Christ has done for us. You hear this moniker in the pro-choice movement, like my body, my choice, versus Christ, here's my body given for you, right? And that's so that sacrificial nature that the gospel shows us in Christ is that opposite of, no, I want to direct my own body to the to the even if that means eliminating another human being, and particularly a human being that is connected to me in my womb, and so this is an issue that obviously is cut and dry biblically, but the process we approach the political sphere with in the American political world right now, that's another discussion, right? And
right.
so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and well, I would and going back to it, it's like that feeds like the two sides of that almost fighting with each other within like being in the same on the same team,
Yep.
kind of feeds that. Like if your pastor isn't saying this specifically,
Yep.
then leave that church or whatever.
Exactly, and that's where I just go like, and yeah, and so those are all good points, and I do think like engage these things, and as a pastor as well, it's like you don't have to, there's a part of me too that's like, ask your questions, push on your pastor in those different sorts of ways. That's great, and as a pastor, I know this comes with the territory, and so I'm not in any sense like don't talk about politics or don't ask your pastor about politics. I literally, like, if you're wondering and you want to seek out a pastor and elder and how should I vote? And here, I mean, we have 18 elders at East Vancouver, right? Not half of them, but probably like 6 to 7 of them are on full-time staff, so connect with your pastor, bring your voting guide, be like, what do you think about this? And that's great. And those are areas where we would work to equip our people on a personal level as well. So let's keep going.
All right, cool. So if we're talking about what the pastor's role is in that,
yeah.
But let's now move to this next part, which like a clear understanding of what our government is for.
Yes, and I think this is super key in equipping people politically in America, right?
And I think one of the reasons this is also a really good question is like a lot of people put unrealistic expectations on our government.
Yes,
right, and is like they functionally act like our government is going to be our savior,
mm-hmm.
or our government is going to be our justification. Like
mm-hmm.
that we are like, if this law happens, then we are now back in good graces with God as a political entity, which there's a whole nother conversation. But what is government for today? And your omissions will kind of tell us what it's not for, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so 1 Peter 2 is one of two really specific places in the New Testament. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him. And then here's the key: to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Now, we don't have an emperor. We don't have a supreme emperor. And so we have a different system of government than Paul is addressing here in the New Testament era. We'll talk about that in a second. But when he says this, governors, right? Sent, and that means a different thing than like what it means here in our state, but like sent by him. This is the purpose of this human institution, sent by God. This is the governor sent by him, the emperor there specifically, to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Romans 13 is the other and probably more consistently quoted area in this. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those who exist have been instituted by God. So even back in 1 Peter 2, these are set up by God, right? And so these are instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists what God has appointed, etc. For rulers are not, and this is the key, verse 3, Romans 13, rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. For he is God's servant for your good, right? And so it goes on a little bit further there. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing, pay to all what is owed, taxes, etc., respect, honor. So you see it in both contexts, and I would summarize it this way. Government exists among men to promote good, to restrain evil. Very simply, right? To punish those who do evil, to reward those who do good. So promote good and human flourishing, restrain evil. Now, we live in a different system of government in the United States than they did in the biblical times. Democracy, representative republic, whatever you want to call it. It's a constitutional republic, technically, but what does our founding documents say? We are a government of the people, by the people, for the people. We're not electing a king or an emperor or an overlord. Basically, in our system of government, every 2 years or every 4 years, we are electing electing representatives, right? And these representatives, or right now in electing a president, this executive, we are hiring this person for a 4-year term, not to tell us what we do, not to tell us what to do, but to do what we want them to do, right? So we are the government. It's a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Very, very unique in human history. So should Christians vote? 100% yes, right? We have a very unique setup in our country, in our system of government. And I think this is key because it's like, I feel like there's this idealism in the American Republic, and I see this on both sides of the aisle, that the George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and sort of these figures that seem larger than life, And I think we get into this mode of like, the president has to be this, idealistic Washingtonian figure. We're hiring a dude or a gal. We're hiring an individual to do a job. The exec role in our system of government is not only the person, and we're not hiring them to be a figurehead. Okay, and are they a figurehead in some sense? Sure, but I just think we begin to lose the plot a little bit when we start to get into that, as if they're going to be an emperor or any of those things. The exec role is key in our system of government because they appoint thousands upon thousands of people in the executive branch of the government. The branch, and again, judicial branch with the judges, legislative branch with the Congress, and the executive branch with the this is our civics lesson for the day, with the president, right? And those three branches are supposed to work together and complement each other and then hold each other accountable. Legislature should create the laws, but the executive has to execute those laws. You've got to sign those laws. And in our system of government right now, the executive branch has grown enormously large. And within that executive branch, this is by appointment. They serve at the pleasure of the president. So when you elect a president, you're electing an entire platform and side of the aisle in the bipartisan, the really two-party system that we have. So when you elect Kamala, you're electing a Democratic, right, in terms of the political party government, and the executive branch should be filled with Democrats who are going to enact Democratic policies. Same thing with Trump. When you elect Trump, you're electing, a Republican executive who's going to appoint Republicans up and down the executive branch. And that's a really key thing to understand because it's not just a figurehead. And this is why we must vote on, and this is just to equip the church to be the church and to think about these areas. You have to vote based on policy over personality, policy over rhetoric, policy over image or feel, right? And so you should know and study, and you don't need to geek out on it. It's actually not that difficult to find this information. The policy platforms of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, because those are the two major parties, and you study those platforms, and then you see within that, what do I feel as a Christian promotes good and restrains evil? What do I feel would be a better bargain in this political moment for both my own, in my family, but key for my community and for our nation, for human flourishing versus evil, right? And so yeah, you got to look at those platforms.
Okay, so all right, let's go back to the policy over personality thing. So like I want to think at three levels, like local, state, and national.
Yeah.
And I think like when I think about local, I actually think personality matters quite a bit. Okay. Because you actually might interact with them, right? You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
And so it's like when I'm looking at city council stuff like that.
Okay,
it's
sure.
Okay, I know them. I know I could have a conversation with them.
Yeah.
Like I know they're reasonable, whatever their political leaning is. And honestly, in Washougal, they're not making too many changes. You know what I mean? Now, when it comes to the state, I feel like in my head it's policy only. I don't care.
Sure.
What whoever is my representative there, whatever. I did at one point whenever we were adopting, and we actually utilized some state
state representative.
Yeah, representatives to help us get some stuff done.
Yep.
But then at the national level, like I get it, and I don't know if I would go policy over personality personally. I would more go policy than personality.
Sure.
And it's when I look at at 1 Peter 2, where it says, "Or to governors is sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good."
Yep.
Now, if I'm looking at the personality of both candidates right now, this is not partisan at all. My thought goes to, I don't know if either of them has a clear understanding of evil and good, and if I could trust that, to trust them to punish evil and do good. Now, God will use them to do that, but that's the primary reason that the last handful of elections, I have not voted for a primary candidate on either side for president. That I have gone third party because it's specifically that evil and good. I don't trust that they. Now, if I went fully policy over personality, then I could maybe look at the platforms and be like, well, that's a little better, and,
and I would say specifically on the national level, and like you said, I get that on the local level of going, okay, personality, interacting, school board people, those kind of things, and so you do want to know personally, and you have more access to those people, and you could even meet them personally and those kind of things. On the state and national level, the thing about the policy versus personality is the living in the world that we do, and with the kind of marketing structures and the media and all these sorts of things, there are ways that the personality or even policies of these key figures running for president, in the case of Kamala and Trump, get passed through the filters of media. There's the things that get emphasized in what they say or do versus not. And dude, I would say in equipping the church in this, on the federal level, above all of these levels, you got to go policy more so than personality, and even personality or rhetoric. And that's why I think this is such a simple election, because you look at it and you go, not just that person getting in place, but that policy platform enacted, not even through that person, but through not only just the president themselves, but through the vice president and through the appointments of the people that are going to be Secretary of State and Attorney General, and all these different roles are going to come from one side of the aisle. And so then you look at and you see the appointments from the Democratic side or the Republican side. You see the way those platforms handle the key issues in our culture today, social issues, economic issues, foreign policy issues, and you say, what's going to be here? Despite what I may feel about that person or any of those sorts of deals. And that's why I feel like this is one of the easiest elections in our lifetime, is because you look at it and you go, we have somebody who was in the White House, who made all these appointments, and who has a track record related to the issues, social issues, economic issues, foreign policy issues in Trump from 2017 to 2020. And then we have 2021 to the present from the Kamala side of it. And though she's not Joe Biden, she's the same party, she's his vice president, all those sorts of things. So I think you look at those two things and you go, the people who they will appoint, and so I just think so much gets clouded in this area, and to be able to go pull back a little bit, look at the 4 years under Trump, there's this is what's going to happen if Trump gets elected, and you go, well, it's not a hypothetical. He was elected in 2016 and he did this stuff for 4 years. So look at that track record, look at what actually happened versus, what's happened the last 4 years in that track record. Compare those two, look at the platforms, and then make an informed decision. I saw this guy, Eric Reed, on Twitter, who I've actually spoken with before, and I wouldn't necessarily call him a friend, but he's an acquaintance. And I retweeted it. He said, he was talking about, he's like, my wife and I voted today. I'm just summarizing what he said. And he said, we didn't take communion before or after. We didn't he's like all these sorts of things that we didn't do. It wasn't like a worship service. It wasn't this big thing. He's like, we just looked at the platforms and we kind of assessed the last 8 years. And then we just made an informed decision that we felt would promote good and restrain evil. Well, it's go and do likewise. And so I think, how should a Christian vote in line with biblical values for someone whose policies and appointments will promote more good and restrain more evil. And like you said, Ty, like when you look at the person personally at the top of the ticket, you're like, I don't know if they, like, if personality wise, do they get this or what this and those kind of deals. And that's where it dude, and I remember in 2015 and 2016 when Trump was first running, and I remember even personally being like, bro, like, what the heck is he going to do? Like, it's, you know, I don't have to say that anymore because I have 4 years of him being the president, and I saw what he did time after time, and I saw the appointments he made and those kind of things. And so I have more of a thing there. And I even remember when Biden got in, you know, in 2020 and thinking to myself and hearing the narratives of you know, from the Biden standpoint and unify the country and all these sorts of things. And then I've just watched what he's done, and not just the policies, but I've even watched the affect, the personality, the rhetoric, and those sorts of things. And you don't have to follow it. Anybody listening to this, to be the church, like, you don't have to follow it as closely as I personally do. But at the same time, I look at it and go, there's enough there that it's not difficult to kind of see these things. What they do, who they appoint, the bills they will sign matter much more than the rhetoric or even the persona in my view. And I just think that's, so yes, this is a more pragmatic and less idealistic approach, but trying to equip the church to be the church.
Yeah. All right. So where do you want to go from here? Like, what do you think?
Yeah. And we haven't had a podcast. I don't know that we've touched on it a little bit. And I think with Ben, one of these days, like we may kind of go through this a little bit more, but you know, there is the question, like, is a Christian voting and voting biblical values, does that promote Christian nationalism? And I look at that and go, that's a much bigger issue, but on the basic level, no.
Like the idea of a Christian just voting at all?
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. Like, and you'll get that. You'll hear this of like a Christian voting or trying to implement biblical values in the culture. Like, no, that's Christian nationalism. No, separation of church and state. And it's really kind of the latest sort of fear tactic from those who don't want, you know, policies that I think Christians would want to enact. And I think Christian nationalism is the latest meaningless phrase in our media landscape, in the sense of just like it's been alt-right. It's been like so many different phrases over the years. And it's always coming from the same side of the aisle, and it's always a pejorative referring to but now it's funny because we live in this era now where one side will insult the other side with a term, and then the other side will take that term and wear it as a badge of honor and write books on it. Like, that's happening. And so the term woke was that, right? Yeah. And the term, what was the other one when Trump first got elected? Fake news. Fake news was something first said by Obama, right? Mm-hmm. And then Trump took it and just, you know, went crazy on it. And so I just think these terms get thrown around a lot, and I think they can cloud the issues for Christians. And so I think to think clearer.
Yeah, another thing on those types of words too is an example within the Christian world is evangelicalism, to where it's like the definition of it has shifted and changed, and what people mean when they say it doesn't like always line up to what somebody's hearing. Yep. And so I hear Christian nationalism as somebody who like read a bunch about it 6-7 years ago, and I hear like, oh, people who like care more about their politics than their faith, that are trying to fit their faith under their politics, rather than what it's come to mean now, which is the separation idea and stuff like that. Yeah,
the institution of Old Testament law and current or whatever. Yeah, and so those we're just really broad brushstroking that and not at all going deeper there. But yeah, I see, and that's where the terminology morphs and changes in the popular culture. So I think the final thing I'd say is just, you know, and I broke this down on these different things. We're not going to necessarily endorse a candidate or whatever here, but
thank you.
But social issues, domestic policy issues, meaning economic issues and the like, and foreign policy issues. These are three super simple buckets, right? Social issues, we talked about abortion, right? And where that's going to be. A Christian needs to be informed on that, informed on their candidates, right? And informed past the level of like, oh, well, the Republican platform changed a little bit in terms of its it's language regarding a national abortion ban. So now it is what, right? And that's where I just think if you look at it on the surface and you follow different personalities who have a stake in the way they're trying to lead people, you may not be clear on exactly, because I've heard people say like, oh no, they're both pro-choice now. And you're like, look into these policies, look into the platforms, look into the judge and judicial appointments. I mean, in Trump's first term, the appointing of 3 Supreme Court justices who, again, and I didn't think this would happen when those were appointed. Roe v. Wade, after 50 years, gets overturned, and that issue goes back to the state. That was a massive, massive multi-generational win for the pro-life movement. And so social issues, pro-life, also sexual ethics issues. I talked about this in my sermon a couple of weeks ago because it talked about sexual morality and purity and those things, but the transgender issue in our culture, where that's at, and where those policy platforms are related to that in our education systems or anything else. You got to know that. Economic issues. And this is one that, like, tax policy and these things are not these areas that people are like nerding out on as much, but there are ways that, like, and I heard this pastor talking the other day, and he was talking about just in the rhetoric, and it was like, okay, here's what needs to happen. And in Europe, he goes, in Europe, when you have a baby, you get 9 months off. And he's talking about all these different issues and childcare is provided, and this is provided, and that's provided. And so, like, that's compassionate. And you got to, like, you have to look past that kind of stuff and go, like, in the economic issue, if we had mandated from the federal level that when you had a baby, you had 9 months off, who's paying that money? Your employer? Your employer's been regulated and mandated from the federal level to pay that money to you? Like, cool. That'd be cool if you had a baby. Like, there are guys listening in this room whose wives have just had babies, right? And they're like, man, I'd be off for another 7.5 months. So, but I'm just saying, like, I get it, but who's paying for these things, right? What does that do in terms of economics and business? And there's an idea in American culture, and I see this in evangelicalism all the time, that, like, the rhetoric that you get from those, and particularly from the left side of the aisle, those that want government to be bigger, right? And like you mentioned, Ty, government kind of as the savior, government as the do everything thing. Like, where's the money going to come from? Taxes will be raised, government will grow, and government, dude, and when it comes to taxes, Romans 13 says it, pay taxes to whom taxes are owed, right? Government has the gun, right? And government has the capability to say, if you don't pay taxes, you go to jail. So government getting bigger for the sake of some idea that that's going to be more compassionate. Where does the scriptures say that? So I do think the scriptures talk about the sin nature of man, the corruption that can be there in institutions that human beings run. And so be aware, restrain evil, promote good. Those are the basics. But economic issues are not as simple as, like, that sounds more compassionate. Let's have the government do it, right? And so that's a key one. And then foreign policy issues is another area, that we think of in terms of the role that America has throughout the world. And these are ones that, like, biblically speaking, it's gonna be harder to thread the needle for you to be like, this is the biblical foreign policy versus this. I do think immigration policy is something that's more domestic policy than foreign policy, but those are things to think about, like, and that issue gets so clouded, I think, within the church as well, because should we be compassionate and loving and welcoming of the immigrant? 100%. Should we have a government policy that incentivizes mass illegal immigration into our country, unlike any other country in the world, and then bring people in and incentivize child trafficking and sex trafficking through those means? Is that compassionate? Is that biblical? No, that doesn't promote good and restrain evil. So can we do both? Yes, we can love and welcome immigrants, which we have a history of here in the United States, which is wonderful, while at the same time having laws that are clear. I mean, this was a lot more controversial, I feel like, 6 years ago than it probably is today, because even the left has seen that, like, okay, we got to do something about the border, right? And so that's more of an issue that is starting to be, at least rhetorically, on the left and right talked about. But look at that. Look at the last 4 years. Look at the previous 4 years. Judge those things, right? And so foreign policy as it relates to wars, these kind of deals, and there's so many things within that to study through. But just think of those as big buckets, right? And then study platforms, think about policy, and be the church.
All right.
And equip your brothers and sisters in love. There it is, dude. political episode.
Well, I know a couple weeks ago I said that like I've heard way less about this than like, or just less tension, I guess, in this election cycle. I did have somebody reach out to me that knows me, and they're like, well, maybe it's because you deleted Twitter a year ago.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, that could be it too. But I will say that I'm ready for it to be over already. So we'll see you next week talking about something else.